Hello and welcome to our weekly discussion of issues of importance to the Caucasus. I'm Dr. Joanne Lasowski, author and journalism educator. And with me today to primarily discuss Monday's summit meeting in Moscow is Matthew Bryza, former ambassador to Azerbaijan. Ambassador Bryza was also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State to Europe and Eurasia, and he's currently a non-resident senior fellow for the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Dr. Lasowski. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Thank you. 11 January in Moscow was called the Karabakh Summit, although Karabakh wasn't mentioned. It was mostly about trade, transportation, and communication. And this is the first time that the leaders got together face to face since the serious fighting ended. We didn't see any hugs at this meeting, but the two leaders did nod to each other from across a big white table. Big picture, how important is this first meeting?
Well, it's really important. There were hugs, by the way. There were hugs of Vladimir Putin together with President Aliyev, and that was, I noticed, it seemed like an emotional one,
yes,
with Putin having a bit of a smile on his face, and then Putin, so maybe I'm reading something into it, but it seemed like he sort of felt obliged to hug Pashinyan, and he gave him sort of a perfunctory, gentle tap on the back rather than sort of the vigorous and heartfelt one he gave President Ilham Aliyev. So leave that bit of atmospherics aside. It's really important. As you said, John, this is the first time that the leaders have met of Azerbaijan and Armenia since they fought a very consequential war. And what was also, there were many things that were significant about it, though, besides that fact. One, it's really important that I think that they decided to focus on an actual concrete action plan to implement the commitments they all made in Article 9, the last article of the November 9/10 agreement, which is to establish a new transportation corridor across Armenia, connecting Nakhchivan and the rest of Azerbaijan, and to restore all communications links in the region. Now, the meeting just now in Moscow on January 11, that seemed only to focus on Azerbaijan and Armenia communications being restored and nothing about Turkey yet. So that's an important point, not only because for me, I live in Turkey and Turkey is a really important member of NATO, but it's important for me as well because it seems to me President Putin, my third point, was using this meeting as a way to cement Moscow's predominant diplomatic position in Azerbaijan, and in this particular context, as the prime mover or the main driver of these new transportation infrastructure projects. If you look at the fine print of what the statement of the three leaders on January 11th, it says that we're going to form basically a senior level working group that will come up with a list of infrastructure projects, and then there'll be subgroups that will work out the specifics of how to implement them, how to develop the projects, and I presume how to attract investment or figure out which governments will pay for what. But that all the projects must be jointly agreed by all three parties to this statement. That means Russia has a veto on the transportation projects that will flow through this new corridor. And Turkey is not mentioned. Turkey's out. So NATO member Turkey, which is a crucial counterbalance, as we talked about last time on this program, a key counterbalance to the Russian peacekeepers, is now apparently being frozen out by Russia when it comes to these infrastructure projects. And I know, from my life here in Turkey, as a business person, in the energy sector and IT, this corridor is of great interest to Turkish investors. There are ideas floating out there for industrial zones that could bring together Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey once the psychological climate in Armenia will accept it. Thoughts about possibly another natural gas pipeline. That gas pipeline, in everything I read, isn't mentioned anywhere because Russia doesn't want it. What is mentioned, though, is rail and road transport through the corridor. So I think this is a very consequential meeting, both in terms of the concrete way new projects can come together, but also in the way that Russia is in the driver's seat. Turkey is not yet present, and of course, the U.S. and France, as the other Minsk Group co-chairs, are nowhere to be seen.
So if you look at the actual things said, Putin says that the war is over. President Aliyev says that it's in the past. But in the Moscow Times, Pashinyan says the conflict is not yet resolved. And there are some issues that need immediate attention. Will Pashinyan's response tend to slow this whole thing down?
I don't think so. I think he is fighting for his political survival. And if we think back a few weeks to the reported assassination planning against him, he's fighting for his physical survival. What this is about, you raised a really important point. This is the crucial point as to whether or not the agreement is going to hold for the long haul. What Pashinyan means, or what he's saying, is that in the November 9/10 agreement, there's no mention of the possible change in legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Little context. The presidents of Armenia at the time, Serge Sarkisyan, and Azerbaijan at the time, Ilham Aliyev, in January of 2009, agreed unofficially that the Minsk groups of the OSCE so-called basic principles were acceptable. And as I said to you before, there were a few details that still needed to be worked out. They were never worked out, but in principle, the overall framework of the Madrid principles or basic principles was approved by the two leaders. And so what was agreed now, or just at the end of the Second Karabakh War, is essentially those same principles, minus one. And the one that is not included is that Nagorno-Karabakh would immediately receive an interim legal status, which means Azerbaijan is saying we accept that Nagorno-Karabakh is not unambiguously part of Azerbaijan from a juridical perspective. And Nagorno-Karabakh receives the possibility, I should say Armenia receives the possibility of a vote by the population of Nagorno-Karabakh at an undetermined time in the future on the final legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh, which could be anything. It could be they choose to remain part of Azerbaijan. It could be they choose to be independent. It could be they choose to become part of Armenia. Frankly, none of us Minsk Group co-chairs or even the leaders, even the leader of Armenia, expected that referendum ever to take place in a time frame, well, that includes our lifetimes. In fact, we used to joke, the Armenian side wanted to call it a referendum. The Azerbaijani side didn't want to call it a referendum for whatever reasons. So we co-chairs joked among all of us that it was a never-endum because it was never going to happen in our lifetimes. But it was important to have the possibility of that final vote. And the immediate ambiguity of Nagorno-Karabakh's legal status for the Armenian leader to say, hey, I got something great out of this, right? The legal status is not unambiguously part of Azerbaijan. There's ambiguity. We're going to claim that Nagorno-Karabakh is not part of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan for now is going to claim Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, and we'll work it out later. So all that detail I just described was in the Madrid principles that both sides unofficially agreed. It was available to Pashinyan before the war, at the first ceasefire, where he approved, or he again embraced the basic principles, and then he rejected them during the war. And it was available to him on, I think it was October 19 and 20, after Azerbaijan had broken through the Armenian line along the border with Iran, when Putin had a call with Aliyev. Aliyev said, okay, I'll agree to the deal with the basic principles, a ceasefire, and then implement the basic principles. And Pashinyan said, no, I'm not going to agree to the basic principles, because the basic principles call for the return of internally displaced Azerbaijanis to Shusha and to all the other territories. And I can't accept that. It would be suicidal. And so the war continued. Armenia lost. Well, when you lose a war, you don't dictate the peace. So President Aliyev and President Putin basically told Pashinyan, you get those same Madrid principles your predecessor agreed to, but you don't get any change in legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh. That point, Pashinyan, of course, hates, because now he looks like the biggest loser. He fought and lost a war, lost whatever it is, 2,800, almost 3,000 Armenian young men, mostly, and ended up in a worse position than he could have been if he didn't even go to war, or if he had taken the deal, if you will, during the war. So he can't, I believe, survive politically if he just says, okay, we're never going to talk about the final legal status again. And he is emboldened in that approach by the French government. On November 10th, the morning that President Aliyev signed the ceasefire agreement, the French foreign minister publicly said, now the Minsk group needs to return to the region and needs to begin negotiations on the legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh. And President Aliyev said, no way. So when the US and French co-chairs showed up in Baku, you may recall President Aliyev said, why are you here? I didn't ask you to come here. So bottom line is, Azerbaijan and Russia say, this is the deal. The conflict is over. There's not going to be any negotiating on Nagorno-Karabakh's legal status. Armenia, with French support, is saying, oh, wait a second, there are going to be negotiations. My take is, the bottom line is, there aren't going to be any, unless Azerbaijan decides it wants them, because Armenia lost. It effectively has no military. Its military protector, Russia, is in Azerbaijan's camp on this one. And France has completely discredited itself as a Minsk group mediator. The U.S. position is ambiguous.
Right, especially now with the new administration. So you mentioned the Minsk group several times, and you had a real significant part in that. None of them were present, as you've already said, but Putin and Pashinyan both mentioned the Minsk group. Mm-hmm. Is that group completely out of the picture now? I mean, you're kind of saying that it is, but have they signed off that they're out of the picture? Do they think they're out of the picture?
So my colleagues who are now Minsk group co-chairs, I think they believe they have a job to do, and they want to find a function. I don't know what that function is, because President Putin, he mentioned the Minsk group, I think, only to garner political cover, right? To say, this isn't a unilateral Russian endeavor, this being this whole peace process and the peacekeepers. No, we're still collaborative, even though he really holds all the cards. Pashinyan's motivation is totally different. It's, again, trying to keep the flame burning, keep the possibility out there with strong French support and ambiguity in Washington. Keep the flame burning that maybe there can be negotiations on the legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's what that's about. So I don't see a function today for the Minsk group, because I don't think there are going to be negotiations on the legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh. However, the French think differently. The Biden administration may end up thinking differently. I really have no idea. But I do think there is a different function for the Minsk group that Russia probably won't like. But I think it would be smart of the Minsk group to take out, and Luke Coffey, the brilliant analyst at the Heritage Foundation, has suggested this to me, that the Minsk group take on the function of negotiating the terms of the length of stay of the Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijan, and then what would come after the Russian peacekeepers, who would provide the successor to a purely Russian peacekeeping force. That would be a useful function, but the Minsk group hasn't said that that's what it wants to do. And it won't be able to, because France is so tilted toward Armenia. And so I think the Minsk group is going to have really nothing to do for a while.
Great idea.
It is a great idea.
Great idea. And speaking of the peacekeepers, before leaving for the summit, before leaving Baku, President Aliyev mentioned on TV that the peacekeepers were overstepping their original mission. But this didn't come up in the summit meeting. Why did Aliyev avoid this issue in the summit meeting, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's such a speculative but important question. My guess would be, number one, the Russian behavior changed. The peacekeepers' behavior changed, and we had that the apparent Armenian forces' violation of the ceasefire around Hadrut, and the Russian forces reacted quickly. It seemed that they disarmed or defused the situation. I think I don't recall the timing exactly, but I think maybe when President Aliyev made that remark, he was still worried about the Russian peacekeepers expanding their zone of operations. My sense is that the Russians haven't used that intervention as a quote unquote land grab, and probably then I would guess that President Putin and the Russian peacekeepers have regained. I don't want to say trust of President Aliyev, because I'm sure he should always be distrustful of those peacekeepers, but at least have decreased his fear that the Russian peacekeepers were pursuing a land grab and establishment of a de facto protectorate, like they've done in South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Transnistria.
Putin mentioned that 48,000 refugees had been resettled. That's a lot in 2 months. That means that the Russians were working nonstop. And they were also offering the resettlers some significant incentives. Where is this going? What's the ultimate goal here? And why are they just resettling Armenians and not Azerbaijanis?
Yeah, well, let me answer the second question first. Azerbaijanis can't be resettled in the formerly occupied territories until the demining operation has concluded. And it's going to take, by the Azerbaijani government's own estimate, maybe 3 years until the towns and villages are inhabitable, because a sufficient number of mines have been removed. And they've said as well, I think it's up to 15 years until all the formerly occupied territories can be safely, let's put it, used again. I mean, the agricultural land, et cetera. So it's, as a purely practical matter, as a matter of human life, it's not possible for the Azerbaijanis to return. So there needs to be, and there will be a huge focus on demining. I think it's really a great thing that 48,000 Armenians have returned to their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh, because this is the way you sustain the peace. This is the way Azerbaijan demonstrates to the world that, Pashinyan's claims aside, or the Armenian National Committee of America's false claims aside, that Azerbaijan was going to commit genocide, that Azerbaijan was going to commit ethnic cleansing, that this is the latest phase of the so-called of the Armenian genocide, with Turkey now participating supposedly. That's completely ridiculous. If 48,000 Armenians have returned to their homes, they feel safe enough to return to their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh because the Azerbaijanis have no intent, with the Turks or without them, to do what has been accused of them. And I think this is a sign that the Russian peacekeepers are actually providing a positive contribution. I wish there were, U.S. peacekeepers there, or NATO, or other non-Russian peacekeepers there, but nobody was ready to provide those forces. So thank goodness the Russians are there. And at the end of the day, for our Azerbaijani audience members, if the settlement, the peace settlement, is seen as one that enabled Armenians and Azerbaijanis to live side by side again, and the Azerbaijani government is invested not in revenge, not in committing an analogous situation like Khojaly, but is instead laying the foundation for economic development of our Azerbaijanis and Armenians together, that is great for the world. And that's going to be great for Azerbaijan, because people are going to see, oh my God, this narrative was so false about Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan won a decisive victory, behaved humanely, didn't drive all the way to the end, whatever that means, of a military victory, but stopped once it recovered Shusha, and allowed for a lasting political, economic, and military settlement that's in the interest of all parties. That would be the biggest diplomatic victory in Azerbaijan's history.
But isn't there a danger can Russia use this and hold on to this population? And with the new demographic change, all Armenians know Azeris. Is there an ulterior motive? Does Russia have an ulterior motive in repopulating just Armenians to this area?
I don't know. Oh no, I would be surprised if Russia wouldn't also be supporting the return of Azerbaijanis to Shusha, which is majority Azerbaijani, or to their homes in the rest of Nagorno-Karabakh, or in the formerly occupied territories. I mean, based on all my experience negotiating with my fantastic Russian counterpart, Yuri Merzlakov, or with Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov, never once did I ever sense that they would not want Azerbaijanis to return. On the contrary, they pushed very hard for that and made it totally clear to the Armenian leadership, whether it was Foreign Minister Oskanyan or Nalbandian or President Kocharyan or Sarkisyan, that that's part of the deal. And that was never disputed, to be honest. That was never disputed by the Armenian side. So no, I don't think the Russians are going to try to resist the return of Azerbaijanis to their former homes. But I do believe, of course, there's an ulterior motive. And every major foreign policy decision is born from a range of interests or goals. Like, of course, it isn't that that Russia decided to intervene the way it did in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict simply because it's a peacemaker. Of course not. Russia is seeking other objectives. And so, Putin, he's a master at, I always think of it as like playing soccer, but with multiple balls on the field. And so if the ball he was playing with a couple of minutes ago is going in the wrong direction, he's going to run over to the ball closer to the opponent's goal and start playing with that one, right? He's all about optionality. And so he's making an investment here. Peacekeepers, okay, it's risky to lead a peacekeeping operation, but it's what Russia has always wanted. They want their boots on the ground in the South Caucasus so that they can use them in the future for whatever purpose they wish. Now it's a noble purpose. It's ending a war and laying the foundation for a just and lasting peace settlement. But in the future, it will very likely be a protectorate, like in, as I said before, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, or if not that. If President Aliyev continues negotiating with so deftly, keeping in mind, using the fact that Putin really wants closer relations with Azerbaijan, so using that to Azerbaijan's benefit, still forever, as far as we can see into the future, there will be Russian troops on Azerbaijani soil. And at some point in the future, for some reason, that may be quite useful to Russia.
And how would that be useful to Russia? To have that really, to gain a more close relationship with Azerbaijan? What are they ultimately seeking?
Well, number one, just influence in general. The Russian and Soviet mindset about geopolitics is to influence, as they call it, the correlation of forces in your direction. So the correlation of what forces? Military, political, economic, psychological, right? And so if you have Russian troops inside Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, it's a sword of Damocles hanging over Azerbaijani government's head always, because of either they're needed there, the peacekeepers, to keep the peace, or because they can be aggressive, right? So you've got this leverage potentially. But B, psychologically, again, in a purely psychological sense, every waking moment of President Aliyev, he knows there are Russian troops on the ground, and so he's got to be, how to put it in a crude way, nicer to Russia. It's not possible, for example, for Azerbaijan then to move toward NATO membership. Not that Azerbaijan has articulated that desire, but this is an insurance policy that there's no way Azerbaijan is going to get any chance to move toward NATO membership. Again, even though Azerbaijan has expressed no ambition to do that. It also, in terms of Putin's ambitions, it sends a message to Georgia, to all the previous constituent republics of the Soviet Union that we're here, we're in the game, we're on the ground, look what we did, we won a victory, you better toe the line. And then finally, it sends messages to both Turkey and to Iran that we are the masters here. Okay, Turkey, we had to let you in with the peacekeeping forces, okay, but you're going to have a secondary role. Iran, you're out. You're out. Don't mess with us. So even though Turkey and Russia and Iran work together in Syria in the Astana process, that doesn't mean they're friends. I mean, they're rivals, and will, because of geography, always be rivals.
You mentioned this earlier, but I want to get a little bit more information from you about why Turkey wasn't participating. Who essentially was keeping them out of this last meeting?
Yeah, that's Putin. Putin called the meeting. He apparently didn't invite President Erdogan. He said, this is a powerful signal. And I'm just thinking back to my days and running my teams in the U.S. diplomatic apparatus, and I used to urge my members of my teams to pay more attention to what is not said than what is said, or at least as much attention to what's not said. So what was not said here was Turkey. Turkey was not mentioned anywhere, wasn't invited. That's clearly a sign that Putin is flexing his muscles toward Ankara and signaling Erdogan, I'm holding all the cards here. You're at the table, okay, sometimes, but not all the time. And then Putin will use that in many other ways in relations with Turkey. Maybe on the S-400s, the Russian air defense systems that Erdogan purchased or Turkey purchased from Russia, and President Erdogan's under intense pressure from Washington not to turn those systems on.
There's, again, about Turkey, there's much talk in Azerbaijan about a Turkish base. But recently, the defense ministry in Azerbaijan said there was no plan whatsoever to open a Turkish base, military base in Azerbaijan. Why did they have to put this out publicly? What does this public announcement tell you?
Yeah, I missed that statement, but what it tells me is that, yeah, they are trying to placate Moscow. Okay. And something is happening behind the scenes. It may be that Turkey doesn't want a base there. It may be that Turkey thinks that if it has an actual base there, it'll create too many difficulties between Ankara and Moscow, or maybe between Ankara and other NATO capitals. There are too many unknowns here. But what is clear is, like, the simple answer is because Russia doesn't want one there.
So let's talk a little bit about Armenia and Turkey. And how do you think the 2009 Zurich protocols come into play here, possibly? Will this agreement, the Zurich proposals or protocols, possibly be brought back into the agenda as a result of all of these people getting back together again? Is it possible that the U.S. and France may push for this?
Well, I say this as somebody who was deeply involved in those negotiations. I think that particular set of documents is really not relevant today in terms of the specifics of it, but the ideas are very relevant, and increasingly so. At the beginning of our conversation today, I mentioned the point that the ninth and final point of the November 9/10 agreement, ceasefire agreement or statement, calls for the how do they put it, the reopening or restoration of all communication links in the region. And so I have confirmed what seems obvious with extremely senior level people, ministers, that of course that means eventually the Armenia-Turkey border will reopen. Yes, it means that. And I mentioned that maybe the protocols are no longer relevant in terms of in detail because, again, being involved in the negotiations at the time, Turkey's perspective, although not publicly articulated, was that that whole process would move forward and the protocols would be ratified only if there was a breakthrough in the Nagorno-Karabakh peace process. Now there's been that breakthrough, the ultimate breakthrough, the conflict's resolved. So there is no reason for Turkey to resist reopening that border now, except to do so at a pace that is comfortable to Azerbaijan. And in Baku, I have, as I said, a very strong sense that the leadership, senior leadership, is looking for the opportunity at the right time to do that as well. And then that will unleash massive investment by Turkish banks and private companies and government companies. And there was talk at this last meeting on January 11th in Moscow of, and there will be major investment, as we said in the beginning, in rail connection and highways, but there could be much more, industrial zones, et cetera. So it's going to happen, I think, but the negotiations are so sensitive now because I think Russia is trying to limit the amount of Turkish involvement, as we've been discussing. I think Russia wouldn't particularly like it if my friends here in Turkey ended up being the big investors through that corridor into Azerbaijan and even Armenia. Because such investment is geopolitically, I think, in Moscow seen as a setback for Russia, but it's what is needed for the region. So the short answer is I think that the concept, the spirit of the Zurich protocols is creeping back, and we're going to see that border reopen soon. And I think we will inevitably see a lot of investment from Turkey and then from Europe into this area. I think with the confluence of Nakhchivan and Turkey and Armenia.
So as a result of this opening of transportation routes with Turkey and Armenia, shouldn't Armenia be more happy about what's happening? If they think of it economically, shouldn't they be more prone to embracing this whole discussion?
Yeah, of course, economically they should, but politics is driven by emotion more than rationality very often, right? And so it's still incomprehensible to the vast majority of Armenians that they lost. The national myth had been we have this mighty military force. We defeated the Azerbaijanis the first time. The Azerbaijanis, as the Armenians like to say, don't really know how to fight. I mean, such humiliating, insulting language. But that was what they said, right? And then we're going to create a greater Armenia. Nagorno-Karabakh is the first step. We're going to recover our lands of Greater Armenia from Eastern Turkey. I mean, that was what was behind Pashinyan's ridiculous, reckless reference to the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Sèvres in August of 2020. When he did that, he was reopening all of those historical wounds with Turkey and saying, we have irredentist aspirations. We want to regain or seize territory that is part of the Turkish Republic now. So there needs to be a lot more time for collective soul searching in Armenia to come to grips with its greatest tragedy since 1915, and they're not ready yet. I mean, I've been poking around in Washington via my think tank colleagues and other sources as to whether or not there are any Armenian Americans who might be psychologically prepared to do just what you said, Joanne, to plan for multilateral investments, to bring the regions together, to help the Armenian economy regain strength. And the answer for now is no. There is nobody who's yet ready in the Armenian diaspora in the United States, but it will come. Time heals all, and it rationally, as you laid it out, this has to happen. Armenia has been excluded from all the major infrastructure projects, East-West projects until now, and it's eventually going to want to get into the game. Of course, it is.
I'm going to close with one last question, and you sort of hinted at it a little bit. How should the new administration find a place at the table? Where do you think they fit in this negotiation and this seeking peace in the region?
That's a great question. I think based on the absenteeism of the current administration, and frankly, the previous one. I mean, well, that's not fair. The first half of the Obama administration, there was a lot of activity. And then at that time, even though there was a Russia reset policy, which was a Russia first policy, because Nagorno-Karabakh is something we work on together so well with the Russians, the Obama administration stuck with it for a while. Trump was never engaged. I think National Security Advisor Bolton, he was interested for a little while, but not sort of in principle, but derivatively, because he was looking for help from Azerbaijan and maybe Armenia to maximize pressure on Iran. So de facto, the U.S. has been absent, and really absent after and during and after the clashes in July along the Azerbaijan-Armenia border. I mean, the absence of the U.S. and France then led to a political vacuum that, as we talked about before, Russia and Turkey filled. And again, as you and I discussed today, if you look at what the possible functions of the Minsk Group are, it's really limited. The agreement that the Minsk Group essentially brokered in principle is being implemented with the absence of any provision for the final legal status or any legal status change for Nagorno-Karabakh. So I don't know what the Minsk Group could do. That's the US's avenue in. Maybe negotiating whatever the follow-on peacekeeping force could be. But I think what the U.S. could do now would be largely sort of a vague and general geopolitical cover that Putin needs. As you mentioned, Putin mentioned the Minsk Group on January 11th in Moscow because he needs that political cover. So that should signal President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken that the U.S. has something. It has some potential leverage over Russia in this case, and it should use it. How exactly to play itself back into the game using that leverage, I don't know. There are multiple things the U.S. could say. It could put pressure on Russia to agree to a sunset for its peacekeepers and a multilateral force to come in. It could press for Turkey to have a higher profile as NATO's tip of the spear in Azerbaijan. But relations between Turkey and the U.S. are fraught. I'm not sure. All I would advise is realize that Putin thinks he needs the Minsk Group, which means he thinks he needs the U.S. imprimatur. And the Biden administration should find some way to use that.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Matthew Bryza, for your insights and background on everything that's happening with the most recent summit meeting. And I hope we get to talk to you again real soon. Thanks.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Dr. Lisowski. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.